It has to be extremely difficult for anyone in the wildlife profession today, in any nation in the world, to escape the realization that our challenges are becoming greater. And not only are they becoming greater in the dimensions of the challenges that we have been familiar with, they are becoming greater in their complexity and in their interactive challenges that they pose. Whether we are talking Africa or Europe or South America, Asia, or the continent of North America, it doesn't matter, ladies and gentlemen. The challenges facing the wild others of this planet are increasing, in some cases, at a desperate pace. We know the statistics. We know the very discouraging loss in biodiversity that we see. We know the incredible habitat loss that is prevalent around the globe. We know about the onslaught on iconic species, the ivory trades, the rhino horn, poaching issues that are occurring. We know about the depletion of the oceans. And we know about the whole problem of globalization, which is not just a physical problem, it's an intellectual problem. It's not just that we're placing more demands on the resources of this one small planet we have, but the trade winds of politics and economics are bringing to conservation cargoes that we have never really handled before. So, we live in a world, too, where it seems to me that empiricism and expert opinion are being deeply challenged, if not displaced in many cases, by the notion that an opinion is expert testimony. This is not a small or simple problem for us in this profession. It is a huge problem for us. If we look at the circumstances of population growth in this world, if we look at the demands we are placing upon the earth, we know that our profession now, this profession of conservation right now, is more important than it has ever been. The time when societies and governments could talk comfortably about change, time when they could tip their hats to the notion of conservation and say, what a lovely idea. Well, by the time we reach the middle part of this 21st century, and we have between 8 and 9 billion of us swarming over this planet, I firmly believe that no one will doubt the importance of what we do. We are headed towards circumstances where social and economic conflict are unavoidable, and the thing that stands in the way of a worsening future is the knowledge we have, the commitment we bring, the determination we forge to not lose one iota without struggle. We don't need to go across the world to know our challenges. We have them here on this continent. People talk a lot about the big African species because they're in the news, but invasive species and climate change, the whole idea about privatizing wildlife that we see happening today, these are all mega issues that we now have to deal with in the context of conservation in North America, the place where the idea was first lifted up and given its great profile, given its momentum, in all its diversity. We now here face enormous new challenges that we must meet. And to the young people in this room, who are the most important in this room, you must be prepared to meet. And beware what those of us who have come through the long arc of experience gives to you is the best we have from the past. What we need now is the best of you for the present and the future. How anyone, therefore, could doubt the fact that we need partnerships is beyond me. We only need to look at the world of nature to understand that we are facing something that is almost impossible to know fully. I have been amazed throughout my career, and I continue to be every day, by conversations with politicians or with other elites, in quotation marks, who believe that this conservation business is a simple thing. It's the kind of thing that young men and women go into because, they love animals or they love being in the outdoors. They wear plaid shirts and blue jeans, and they have a kayak at home. And then they sort of suggest, but they must get on with the complicated business. This endeavor that you are involved in, as I have many times tried to express, is the most complicated endeavor in the human tradition. It is the intersection of economics and politics, of ecology, of human emotionality, of human culture, of changing systems of belief, and of a desire for this animal here in this room to try to make the best life it can. We have the limits to our knowledge that we must understand, and we have the rareness of this one finite planet. And as far as we know, good ones are very hard to find. Wildlife no longer exists by accident. The idea that some have that all we need to do is step man out of the theater, take him out of the arena, mankind, and that all will be well, is a complete and utter fallacy that can only be borne by someone who lives like a mushroom in the dark. There is not a species that lives upon this planet today whose future is not determined by the decisions we make, the decisions we defer, or the decisions we avoid. Not one. The Edenic myth has to be broken down. We are in an extraordinarily practical business, ladies and gentlemen, and it is becoming more like politics every single day. And a cautionary note: when we all bemoan the fact, including myself, that we do not see conservation up there on the banners of discussion for the individuals running now for the presidency of the most powerful nation in the world, in the back of my mind, I have a small little creature that sits there and says, "Be careful what you wish for." It is becoming more political, and we better be able to play that game really well before we get into that arena. I am reminded constantly in the discussion of partnerships and coalitions and changes of governance and the need for new approaches. I am constantly reminded of the history of this country, by which I mean the United States of America. And I'm constantly reminded by how we launched the conservation movement in the first instance. Does anyone believe that it was possible to introduce the miracle of change that confronted the ideological, religious, and commercial perspectives of a young nation and change them into something that valued sustainable use and the conservation of wild places and wild creatures? Does anyone still believe anywhere that this could have been done without partnerships? Close down the millinery trade for the slaughter of shorebirds when egret feathers were worth more than a pound of gold. Partnerships were needed. Different partnerships, strange partnerships. The suffrage movement by the women of the United States of America. Well, imagine if we suggested today, let's build a partnership like that. But that's what saved so many of those species we see. That and people like Roosevelt and others who were working together in partnership to achieve it. Do we think the great whale resurgence that has occurred for species like humpbacks and so on around the globe was possible without partnerships? That someone simply sat in their office as a cetacean scientist and said, "Let there be whales." No. We began in partnership. Along the way, we have squandered a lot, allowed divisions to arise that should not, wasted our time on battles beneath us, wasted scarce resources on unimportant issues. And we don't have the time to make those mistakes again. Because we may take hope in our successes, but dream what we would have if we had maximized every potential we had. Dream about what we would not have lost. 50% of all the vertebrate population numbers in the last two generations of human beings on this planet. 50% of all the great rainforests. So, I hope you agree. It might not be a bad idea to think about partnerships. So we ask, what would be the benefits of partnering? This too perhaps is a bit obvious. Maybe the downsides and our fears of partnerships offer a little more intriguing areas of exploration. Partnerships bring diversity. They bring adaptability. They bring resilience. They bring resource provisioning and cost sharing. And they bring multiplicative effects, not just additive. All of those things remind me of nature, does it not remind you too of nature? Resilience, adaptability, stability, complexity. We only need to learn from the natural world. But there is also inspirational power in partnerships, ladies and gentlemen. I have seen it a dozen times. All of you have seen it. All of you have seen the human capacity emancipated through partnerships. All of you have felt the glow of good feeling about this when it happens. You know inherently as a human being, as the ape who dances and sings, you know inherently it is a good thing. No one needs to write it out for you so you can read it. You feel it here. You know it there. Partnerships open those novel highways, that excite us. We're driven to novelty. We're driven to novelty. That's where the scientists come from. And in partnerships, we find novelty that lay under our noses all along. Beautiful, human novelty. Like a discovery of a rare painting in some old shed. And of course, the most important thing about partnerships is the scale of opportunity they provide. We live now in a global world. What happens in the economy of one country influences the conservation of wildlife in another. What happens in terms of the social attitudes that emerge in one nation influence the attitudes that arise in another. We have species that we have come to understand and know need vast expanses. Sometimes different continents must be available to them to live their life cycle and survive. We know that the big, fierce animals are rare for a reason, and we know they demand great space. We know we have all kinds of problems of scale. And I ask you now, without partnerships, could anyone conceive, even conceive, of accomplishing the Y to Y notion, from Yellowstone to the Yukon, a corridor by which the wild others of great diversity may move in landscapes that might be forever protected? Does anyone believe that a director of an agency, a biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or someone who leads an NGO could possibly even dream the idea with any chance of it succeeding without partnership? The answer is no. So what kind of partnerships, then, do I think we need? My very simple answer to that, and again, it is to the young people in this audience especially, all kinds. A lot of times when the people you look up to and the people who are senior in their positions talk about the desire for change, you must be aware that we are often guilty of wanting to do more of the same, but call it change. We need all kinds of partnerships, novel kinds, goals-oriented kinds, wildlife-centric kinds, and people-centric kinds. We need sustainable kinds. We need incentive-driven kinds. We are living in a world where the battles I fight in the IUCN are more and more and more around how to incentivize people to keep wildlife with them. It is fine to have a junco in your backyard, but a pissed-off elephant is another matter. We need fearless, bold, and inspirational kinds of partnerships. And as I said, not partnerships just to do the same. And how do we get there? . I take an enormous amount of my understanding for this country, the United States of America, which I have come to spend a great deal of time in and greatly admire, from the great statesmen who forged this nation out of partnerships, difficult partnerships, extraordinarily difficult partnerships. And we may not necessarily have to go all the way back to the Constitution, which is the best place to begin in terms of this, but we can certainly think of the partnerships that had to be built to end slavery in this country and to put behind this nation the bloodbath of the Civil War. We have to think about the partnerships that allowed people like Theodore Roosevelt to manage to do the great things he did. Believe it or not, he didn't do it all himself. Partnerships enabled FDR to do the things he did. And we see in all of these people the deep empathy, the wisdom, the practicality, the ability to forge a future out of crisis through partnerships. This is your history, your history. This is what has made you the nation you are. In Canada, we fought our own needs for confederation of separate units, and partnerships there were the only way to forge that nation as well. Now, we talk a lot about change in structure, issues of governance, and let me only say, in this regard, that we have a public trust doctrine for a reason. Many years ago at a Western Association meeting, I called for a review of the public trust doctrine that eventually the Wildlife Society undertook. And we are still struggling with how we are really going to make it manifest in the decades and century ahead. But structural change of agencies and organizations and the rise of different organizations is now absolutely necessary, and it is inevitable. The pace we can control. The deterministic arc is impossible for us to halt. So if we look at these things, if we look at the need for determination and empathy, and I would add tolerance and inclusivity and good humor, and a decision not to criticize and vilify different opinions around the table discussing conservation issues, which goes on every day. We will only establish what I believe is needed in our two countries now, and I say it here today, which is a conservation constitution. Our two nations need to work together to build this idea right now, after this. We will only achieve such a thing if we bring humility to the process, but above all, if we bring love. You know, in our circles, these kinds of words are often set aside, as though somehow they don't belong in the vocabulary of the professional or the scientist. Well, it is only by virtue of love for the wild others of this planet that we have any hope. We may become frustrated when the rising empathy for wildlife seems to lead us in directions we are not comfortable with. But I can tell you that the only hope for the wild others that share this place with us is how much love we can build for them. Love for what they represent in and of themselves, and further simply their continued existence, which implies that we have a future, for the beauty they express, for the awe that they instill in us, the fascination they evoke, and yes, the deep empathy we feel for them when they have not spoken a single word. Wish that we could communicate so well. There will be a deep wound in our world, and their loss would represent. It will be a darkening of our hopes and a great unnatural loneliness would be what we would inherit. Surely these words, surely these beliefs, surely these honest ideas need to find a place in our parlance and also to be part of the means by which we build the partnerships that we need. Of the island on which I live, Newfoundland, there are many smaller islands which contain multitudes of seabirds in their millions. I have crawled over them, hauled them out of their little burrows and looked at their chicks and weighed their eggs and slipped off ropes into the sea and done all kinds of crazy things. Sometimes when I go around these islands today, the thought occurs to me, what about the birds did not come back? Not just for a year, but for a decade, for many decades, forever. What would I have lost? I would have lost a part of myself that no human engagement could ever replace. With no loved one, with no challenge of humankind, could it ever be replaced. So I ask us all to give deep thought to the idea of partnerships, to understand that they are not without risk, that some in this room will lose authority and power through the building of partnerships, that some of our own profiles will be diminished undoubtedly, that new stars will shine in the heavens. But each of us only has a short time to give and to help wildlife. And collectively, we can do more for them. And collectively, we must. Thank you all very much.